What's going on? YouTube, listen up. Young Elder Gang. This is Charles P. Winston at you with another banger. Please make sure you like, subscribe and share this video. Fam, I hope this video get at least 100,000 likes. In this video, you will find history definitions, scripture, information, and best of all, what we Americans have been deprived of from the beginning. The truth, keep in mind, this content used in this video is intended for entertainment, educational and informational purposes only. We will give you the total truth as we best understand it. Today, be sure to hit that like button, Young Elder Gang, hit that subscribe button if you're new to the channel, hit that bell, and don't forget to check back with us every day for new content. Imagine a bomb, not of steel, but of chemistry and social engineering. It didn't explode in a flash, it seeped into Black America in the 1980s, detonating slowly. Its name was crack cocaine, cheap, potent, and devastating. This was no accident. Crack was the perfect weapon for a war waged in America's own streets. The damage wasn't a single blast, but a relentless demolition of families and hope. The fallout poisoned generations, leaving devastation we still navigate today. Crack was more than a drug. It was a weapon of mass destruction aimed at the heart of Black America. The fuse was lit, and the consequences still echo. To trace the crack epidemic, look south, to 1980s Nicaragua. The Reagan administration secretly funded the Contras, a right-wing group fighting the Sandinistas. The CIA looked the other way as their allies trafficked cocaine into the US, fueling the crack crisis. That cocaine flowed into black communities, especially south-central Los Angeles, creating a devastating epidemic. The consequences were catastrophic, reshaping entire communities and leaving scars that still haven't healed. On the 20th of December 1989, the United States launched its biggest military operation since the end of the Vietnam War. More than 25,000 soldiers poured into the small Central American Republic of Panama, supported by air power and a huge intelligence operation. On December the 20th last year, the Latin American Republic of Panama was being liberated. On paper, the invasion was about restoring democracy. In reality, this was a drug bust, carried out to arrest one of America's most wanted traffickers. And this drug lord wasn't your typical on-the-run fugitive hiding out in the jungle. In fact, it was Manuel Noriega, the head of the Panamanian military and de facto ruler of the entire country. The World Banker labeled and blamed Noriega for the terror on the streets of the USA. And somewhat awkwardly for the US, Noriega had been a key American ally and a CIA intelligence asset for decades. This is how the Cold War met the war on drugs, and how the CIA helped to create a cocaine dictator. Panama is a relatively small country, and there's no particular reason why it should be considered a vital strategic interest to the US military. Apart from one thing, the Panama Canal. About 5% of all global trade passes through the canal, which tends to make the US sit up and pay attention. Throughout the 20th century, America ran the canal directly, through a series of military bases here, here, and here. The United States is deeply engaged in the anti-communist struggle, in the competition with the Soviet Union. The United States was concerned that the Soviet Union was making a play for Latin America. Panama was a key player on the side of the United States. Manuel Noriega first came to work for the CIA all the way back in 1955. By the mid-1960s, he was receiving specialist training in intelligence and psychological warfare at the infamous School of the Americas, where the US military trained many of Latin America's most prolific human rights abusers. More than 200 Latin American students hailing from 18 different nations studied technical skills and leadership techniques at the school. After a coup in 1968, Noriega rose to become head of military intelligence. And this is when his career, both as a CIA spy and a drug trafficker, began to take off, with Noriega using his position to provide protection to drug shipments from South America. Essentially, he's taking money from drug traffickers to help them out, but at the same time, he's cooperating with the CIA, with military intelligence. He becomes more useful to the CIA and to the DIA, to military intelligence. Perhaps the most controversial question surrounding Noriega's involvement with US intelligence is how much the CIA knew about his drug trafficking and either chose to ignore it or actively protect him. This is particularly relevant to future President George H.W. Bush, who in the mid-1970s was head of the CIA. His drug trafficking was not a mystery to the CIA. The CIA was working with many people in Central America in this period who were involved in drug trafficking. The same people who were transporting guns, on our behalf in many cases, were also transporting cocaine. George Bush Sr. in 1976 is head of the CIA. Noriega actually goes to meet with Bush in Washington around this period. Noriega's involvement in drugs was serious enough that, as early as 1972, the Nixon White House actually considered assassinating him. But he was considered so essential by the CIA and the Pentagon that the plan was never carried out. And awkwardly enough, for George Bush's later claims of ignorance, in 1976, the CIA actually put Noriega on a regular annual salary that eventually rose to over $200,000 a year. The head of the CIA at the time being George Bush. Then, in 1983, Noriega took full control as de facto dictator of Panama. Noriega went straight into business with the rising Colombian cartels, giving them landing strips for their cocaine shipments at upwards of $100,000 per flight. Did drugs get transported in his aircraft through this deal that you arranged? We set up a deal that ended up in a drug shipment. When Pablo Escobar murdered the Colombian Minister of Justice in 1984 and had to go on the run, it was Noriega's Panama that offered him shelter. At the same time, Noriega was keeping up his contacts with the American intelligence agencies. Any drug trafficker who didn't pay could be reported to the DEA, effectively making them the muscle of Noriega's narco protection racket. And Noriega wasn't just cashing in on the cocaine flowing north to the US. For decades, America had encouraged Panama to resist communism by becoming the Switzerland of Central America, establishing a strong banking sector with extremely strict privacy laws. This, of course, was very handy for drug cartels needing to launder money. And plane loads of cash began flying in from Miami, with Noriega providing protection until the money could disappear into the opaque Panamanian banking system. The drug underworld is swimming in a sea of money, money that filters back into the legitimate economy. The real money starts. The Medellin cartels in Colombia are now very active. Drug trafficking is going out of control. Billions of dollars are being produced by the cartels, and Noriega is offered a chunk of that. Noriega was able to keep getting away with all this throughout almost the entire 1980s, partially because the Reagan administration was supporting right-wing rebels known as the Contras as they fought a bloody civil war in Nicaragua. Congress had made supporting the Contras illegal, so this all had to be done off the books. And that's when Noriega came in. He was providing intelligence. That's number one. Number two was arms shipments. So, between the booming cocaine trade and clandestine military supply chains, how did it all come crashing down? In the early 80s, an opponent of Noriega's in Panama named Hugo Spadafora made a series of very public accusations about Noriega's drug trafficking activities. The military seized Spadafora, and a day later his tortured and decapitated body was discovered. But what probably brought down Noriega was more that he'd simply outlived his usefulness. Hugo Spadafora Franco was a Panamanian physician and guerrilla fighter in Guinea-Bissau and Nicaragua. He criticized the military in Panama, which led to his murder by the government of Manuel Noriega in 1985. The Cold War was winding down, and the American defense establishment was getting less paranoid about communists and twitchier about drug cartels. If we can't take Noriega with the power that we have in the area, how are we going to deal with the drug lords in Mexico, Colombia and Bolivia? And when are we really going to take on that war? In 1988, Noriega was indicted in a Miami court on multiple drug trafficking charges. During his election campaign, George Bush was being questioned about his CIA links with Noriega, but that didn't stop him from winning the presidency a year later. I mean, anybody who sits there and does nothing and says he didn't know that Noriega was doing drugs and running drugs and is a suspected murderer, in my judgment, doesn't have what it takes to lead this country. In his first TV address as president, Bush held up a bag of crack and declared a major escalation in the war on drugs, claiming it was a just cause. Victory over drugs is our cause, a just cause, and with your help, we are going to win. In a not overly subtle reference to Bush's drug policy speech, the invasion was called Operation Just Cause. Noriega was the intelligence hub in Central America. He knew where the bodies were buried, on all sides. He knows what the CIA is doing and all of the dirty work that we are participating in. The interesting thing is that he never uses that information. Over 500 Panamanians died in these drugs busts, along with 23 US soldiers. Noriega tried to claim diplomatic asylum in the Vatican embassy in Panama, but US troops surrounded it and blasted Van Halen's songs until he couldn't take any more and surrendered. He's a fugitive drug dealer, and we want to see him brought to justice. And if that helps, if there's some incentive for some Panamanian to turn him in, that's $1 million that I would be very happy to sign the check for. The potential for embarrassment is high, with the defense team promising revelations of CIA involvement in the murky world of international drug smuggling and gun running. Noriega was flown to Miami, stood trial under drug charges, and was sentenced to 40 years. He served 17 before being extradited to a prison term in France, and then to another in Panama before dying in 2017. For all the bullets fired, people killed, and billions spent on the war on drugs since Noriega was sent to prison, the drug trade has only increased, and the people who run it have only got richer. We'd like to congratulate drugs for winning the war on drugs. Before crack, black neighborhoods were battered but resilient, held together by churches, businesses and family ties. Crack tore that fabric apart, unleashing desperation and violence. Addiction turned neighbors into strangers, and fear replaced trust. The underground drug trade eclipsed legitimate work, offering fast money to those with no other options. Gunfire became routine. Children learned to sleep in bathtubs to dodge bullets. The drug market replaced the corner store and the barbershop. Families collapsed under the weight of addiction. Parents lost, children abandoned, grandparents raising a new generation. The term crack baby became a cruel label, stigmatizing children born into chaos. Institutions, churches, community centers were overwhelmed or silenced. Police, seen as outsiders, couldn't or wouldn't stop the spiral. The neighborhood became a prison, hope replaced by survival. The bomb had done its work, leaving a landscape of social ruin. The unraveling wasn't just personal tragedy. It was the systematic destabilization of a people. The scars of that unraveling are still visible today. The media didn't just report the crack epidemic, they shaped its narrative. Nightly news showed black men in cuffs, women in crack houses, and crack babies in incubators. The story wasn't about public health or failed policy. It was about moral decay and a dangerous black underclass. Context vanished. No talk of unemployment, failing schools, or how drugs flooded in. The focus was on black users and dealers, depicted as monsters. This narrative justified a war, not compassion. Politicians and media fueled a moral panic, making it easy to declare war on communities instead of helping them. The language was militarized: scourge, plague, super predators. The media dehumanized victims, paving the way for brutal policies. Meanwhile, powder cocaine, favored by the wealthy, was treated as a personal vice, not a crisis. The racial bias was blatant. Crack was a black plague, powder a white indulgence. The media didn't just reflect society, they loaded the gun for politicians to pull the trigger. This coverage manufactured consent for mass incarceration. The real story of policy, poverty, and systemic neglect was buried. The media's narrative still shapes perceptions and policy today. The public enemy was crafted, and the consequences were devastating. Fueled by fear, Congress passed the Anti-Drug Abuse Act of 1986. It created harsh mandatory minimums and a notorious 100-to-1 sentencing disparity. 5 grams of crack meant the same sentence as 500 grams of powder cocaine. This wasn't about science, it was about race and class. Black communities bore the brunt, with low-level dealers getting harsher sentences than major traffickers. The law became a dragnet, filling prisons with young black men, users and small-time dealers, not kingpins. Policing became militarized. SWAT raids, no-knock warrants, and civil asset forfeiture devastated families. Courts were overwhelmed. Plea bargains replaced fair trials. Justice became a conveyor belt to prison. The legal system turned from shield to sword, wielded against black America. The war on drugs didn't solve addiction, it created mass incarceration. The promise of justice was broken, replaced by a system of punishment. The legacy of these laws still haunts America. For many, the crack epidemic felt like history repeating itself, a new form of state disruption. The FBI's COINTELPRO in the 1960s and 70s targeted black liberation groups using infiltration and violence to destroy movements. When crack hit, it achieved similar goals: sowing chaos, destroying cohesion, and neutralizing political power. Communities turned inward, focused on survival, not liberation. The theory that crack was used to destroy black communities is often dismissed, but history makes that suspicion hard to ignore. COINTELPRO's legacy of sabotage set the stage for the devastation crack would bring. Whether by design or neglect, the result was the same: a political threat neutralized, a population subjugated. The ghosts of COINTELPRO haunt the crack era. The state's history of using any means to maintain control is undeniable. Crack was a more insidious weapon, one that left communities shattered and distrustful. The pattern of disruption is clear, and its effects are lasting. The scars of these policies run deep. The crack bomb's most enduring aftershock is mass incarceration. The war on drugs created a prison boom. America has 5% of the world's population, but nearly 25% of its prisoners. Black Americans were arrested and imprisoned at far higher rates for the same offences. A generation of black men was removed from society, destabilising families and communities. Children grew up with trauma and stigma. Families lost breadwinners, and neighbourhoods lost leaders. The prison pipeline became a grim rite of passage. Once released, the punishment continued. Felony convictions meant lost rights, housing and jobs. Michelle Alexander calls it a new Jim Crow, a permanent undercast. Successful re-entry became nearly impossible, trapping people in poverty and recidivism. The crack era stole futures, replacing hope with control and punishment. The aftershocks are still felt: broken families, impoverished communities, and deep distrust of police. The prisons may be hidden, but their social cost is everywhere. The lost generation is not a metaphor, it's a reality. The damage endures, shaping lives to this day. The physical scars of crack linger: heart attacks, strokes, respiratory issues, and chronic health problems. Survivors now face old age with the burdens of addiction and trauma. The psychological wounds run deeper. Addiction, violence, and childhood trauma haunt generations. Stigma made it worse. Crack addiction was seen as a moral failing, especially for Black Americans. This prevented many from seeking help and created lasting shame. The crackhead stereotype dehumanized and isolated people. Families bore the brunt. Grandmothers raised grandchildren, and crack babies grew up under a cloud of stigma. While fears of a permanently damaged generation were exaggerated, the hardships were real. Rebuilding trust and kinship is a slow, painful process. The bomb may have stopped exploding, but its radiation lingers. The legacy of health, family, and stigma is still unfolding. Amid devastation, resilience emerged. Mothers organized patrols, reclaiming streets from dealers. Community leaders opened churches for support groups and sanctuary. Survivors found recovery, becoming counselors and mentors. Their stories, rarely told, are the true heart of this saga. Today, movements fight to end mass incarceration and reform drug laws. The Fair Sentencing Act reduced the crack-to-powder disparity, a small step toward justice. The opioid crisis, met with compassion, exposes the racial hypocrisy of past drug wars. The lesson: addiction is a health issue, not a moral failing. Poverty and despair fuel drug crises, not inherent criminality. As new challenges arise, we must choose treatment over punishment, support over stigma. The communities shattered by crack are still healing, their resilience a model and a warning. Their story is not just one of ruin, but of hope and hard-won survival.